So we talked about CSS float, right? The float property allows us to kind of control if we want to throw things and kind of push them to the left or throw them to the right, right? And we can do that by controlling float left or float right. And we're starting to see a little bit more of a layout like this Facebook page, right? And now we could start adding background colors and things like that. So let's, just to illustrate that, if we grab this parent div class and add a background color to it. So this is the big red rectangular box here. If we said parent dash box, we said background color, or we can just say background for shorthand and say, blue. It's going to look ugly, but if I save that and I refresh, sorry, this was called parent div. Remember, you got to have those names consistent there. There you go. Now we can start adding some background color. It doesn't look, that good or professional, but you're getting the idea. That's how they're kind of filling in the colors here and creating these visual layouts. Right, so we looked at floats, and floats are a good way to do that. I'll remove that ugly blue for now. Now, what if we want even more control over the positioning? That's where we can look at the concept of relative, absolute, or fixed positioning. So every element on the page has a position attribute. So let's take some of this out for now. And we'll just take this out as well so we can just see what it looks like by default, right? So we have these divs laid out in this kind of parent-child layout. And like I said, every div or every element has a position attribute. So let's go ahead and target this div left here. So we're going to go ahead and target it by typing the dot syntax, and we say div left, right? And what we can do is say position, and by default, all divs and all elements have position static. Okay, so it's invisible. We don't even have to write that, and it comes with the HTML document automatically. So if I did write it, you'll see nothing will change. Now what's cool is we can do position relative. Okay, so this is one of the positioning rules that I like. But by changing the value to relative, we can now control how far from the left or from the right something will appear. So from its default location. So by default it spits out right here. Now if I wanted to move it just over maybe 100 pixels, we can control that particular div and move it over from the left 100 pixels. That's what we've done. And if I want to move it away from the top, maybe, another 100 pixels, there you go. Now it's moved all the way down here, and it's kind of overlapping, as you can see. So that's a little bit about positioning. We can actually control where exactly it's positioned. Now, that's relative positioning. That's the one I like to use the most because it's pretty simple. It's basically saying, okay, from where it would normally be dropped in, so if I took everything out, if I add this special attribute or property, say relative, then from here I can now, because I have this, I can use these special keywords like top or left or bottom or right and say, okay, I want to push it away from the top, 10 pixels from the top, and do these fine adjustments like that. So there's another value we can use, which is called absolute. And you want to be very careful when you use absolute, because there's a couple things that happen. First of all, when you use absolute, you'll see that the space we've reserved by default for this div here, right? It's going to go away. We're going to just get rid of it. It's as if the div wasn't actually there. Even though the div will appear on the page, once you say absolute, it's going to take it away. That space that's kind of sitting here, this white space will go away. So watch, when I refresh, you'll see everything kind of moved up, and this thing is still here, this div we're targeting, that says position absolute, but the space for it is gone. So that's why you have to be really careful when you use position absolute. And the other kind of gotcha that there is with the position absolute is that typically what you want to do is, notice this is the one that we gave the absolute positioning to, and that's why there's no space for it. But typically what you want to do is look for its parent div and give it the position relative. So we'll say parent div position relative. And the reason why is because anything that you position with absolute, it needs something relative to position from. So now notice when I refresh it, we're positioning relative to this parent div, and it's set to absolute. We give it a top of 10 pixels. Let's get rid of that and just see where it sets it. Now if I were to do right and I say 0, we'll say go all the way to the right. We want it distanced from the right by 0 pixels. That means it's going to be stuck to the right here. If I refresh it, there we go. But again, notice there's no space for it like there used to be. If I get rid of this, again, now everything is moved down and the space for it is reserved and it's there. So that's the tricky thing about position absolute. You can get really good control with position absolute, but you need to remember to apply position relative to its parent, and you also need to, make sure that it's going to lose that space that it had there. It's kind of like it loses that seat if it's going to have the freedom to be placed wherever you want. And so again, we can do, right, top, however we want, and just to illustrate that even stronger, you can throw it almost anywhere you want. Right? So, but it's always relative to this parent div. Now, I could have said, let's make it relative to the body, and what's going to happen is the CSS is just going to look for the nearest div, the nearest parent div that has position relative. So I took it out of there and placed it here. It's not going to look different, but now you know that this position absolute is positioning itself relative to the body tag, which is this parent, not this direct parent. Okay, so I know that's a little bit tricky to understand, but you'll get the hang of it. I do recommend that you try to stick with position relative when you're doing your actual, fine adjustments, like, making something appear on the, kind of like the way we were before. So if we said relative here, I recommend that you use position relative if you can get away with that first, because that's just going to be easier. It's closer to its more natural state, which is position static, right? By default, every element has this on it, whether we define it there or not. And so relative just kind of borrows from that and says, okay, from where it would normally appear, let's move it, 20 pixels from the top of where it would normally appear. So that's the better way to position, in my opinion. Now, the last way, and probably the least common use of position, is fixed. And fixed is just, it's always going to be fixed in a certain location on the actual page. So I can say, for example, let's say 20 pixels from the right. It's fixed there. And again, just like absolute, it loses its original placement. It loses its original place where it was. And now you can see it's always going to be fixed there, no matter how wide or how small. So that's just, it's useful in some cases, like if you want a sticky header or a sticky footer that's always there, we could say bottom, and there we go, and it's, maybe call it footer. Not that you would write the markup like this, you would place it down here somewhere in your code. But now that's always going to be there no matter what. No matter how small the page is, it's always going to show up right there. So that's a little bit about the different types of CSS positioning. I do want to point out, in a lot of cases, you may want to explore using the Bootstrap library from Twitter. And it's going to take a lot of the headache out of dealing with positioning and things like that. And we can explore that down the line, but this is going to allow for much greater control with a lot less code on our end. Okay, we can use their library and use their grid system and avoid all of that. So definitely check out the Bootstrap website. It's at getbootstrap.com to kind of learn more about how you can take advantage of it without having to go in there and writing out all the position and float controls yourself.